The easiest way to measure a person's character, my grandmother used to say, is to watch how they treat someone they believe has nothing to offer. I didn't understand those words until the night an entire ballroom decided I was trash, and the most feared man in New York calmly decided I was his wife. 48 hours earlier, my biggest concern had been whether the rent check would clear before my landlord tried calling again. I was 25 years old, working double shifts as a waitress while finishing nursing school, and every dollar already had a destination before it reached my bank account. My white sneakers were hidden beneath a pair of polished black dress shoes that pinched my feet with every step, part of the hotel's formal uniform for charity galas where wealthy people congratulated each other for being generous. The Grand Lexington Hotel sparkled beneath towering crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across polished marble floors. Violins floated through the air while servers carried silver trays balanced with practiced smiles. Everything smelled like expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and food I could never afford to order for myself. I adjusted the cuff of my black uniform and glanced at my reflection in one of the gold-framed mirrors lining the ballroom. Claire Bennett looked exactly how management wanted her to look. Hair neatly tied back. Makeup barely noticeable. Smile polite but invisible. Present enough to serve. Forgettable enough not to exist. That was the unspoken rule. People noticed the champagne. Nobody noticed the woman carrying it. Table 16 needs another bottle, my manager whispered as he hurried past without slowing down. And try not to get in anyone's pictures this time. I nodded automatically. After 3 years in hospitality, responses like that had become second nature. Keep moving. Keep smiling. Keep disappearing. As I crossed the ballroom, conversations drifted around me like radio stations fading in and out. Stock investments. Vacation homes in Aspen. A new yacht somewhere off the Florida coast. Someone laughing about spending more on a watch than I owed in student loans. Another guest complaining that her driver had taken the wrong route through Manhattan traffic. Their lives sounded so impossibly distant that they might as well have belonged to another planet. I reached table 16 and carefully poured another glass of sparkling water for an older woman wrapped in diamonds that flashed every time she moved her hand. She didn't look at me. None of them did. To them I wasn't Claire. I was simply the girl refilling glasses before quietly fading back into the background. Strangely, I preferred it that way. Being invisible usually meant being safe. But life has a strange sense of humor. Sometimes the very night you pray no one notices you becomes the night everyone remembers your name. The evening settled into its familiar rhythm, the kind that made hours disappear without anyone noticing. Glasses emptied and filled again. Elegant laughter drifted beneath the music. Every polished surface reflected another version of a world where everything looked effortless. I balanced a silver tray against my shoulder as I crossed the ballroom for what had to be the 100th time, silently counting tables instead of minutes. Table 8 wanted another bottle of sparkling water. Table 12 needed fresh coffee. Table 19 had requested gluten-free desserts after already finishing 3 courses. Small requests. Endless requests. That was the job. You smiled, you remembered preferences, and you became invisible again. I had almost convinced myself the night would pass without incident when I noticed a little boy standing alone beside one of the enormous marble columns near the ballroom entrance. He could not have been older than 6. His tiny navy blazer looked expensive enough to make me nervous, but his wide blue eyes looked exactly like every frightened child I had ever seen during my nursing rotations. He kept scanning the crowded room, gripping the sleeve of his jacket as if it were the only thing keeping him brave. Adults swept past him carrying crystal glasses without slowing down. Nobody seemed to realize he was standing there by himself. I placed my tray on the nearest service station before kneeling so I would not tower over him. "Hey," I said softly. "Are you looking for someone?" He nodded without speaking. His lower lip trembled just enough to answer the rest of the question for him. "Your mom or your dad?" Another small nod. "Do you know their names?" He hesitated before whispering, "Uncle Adrian." The name meant nothing to me. I smiled anyway. Then let us find your uncle. He slipped his small hand into mine without hesitation, and together we walked carefully along the edge of the ballroom. I asked him about school, about his favorite baseball team, about whether he liked chocolate cake more than ice cream. His answers grew a little longer each time, and by the time we reached the grand staircase, he was smiling again. It amazed me how quickly children trusted simple kindness when the world remembered to slow down. Then something changed. Conversations softened one by one until the room seemed to inhale at the same moment. I looked toward the entrance. Several men in perfectly tailored black suits stepped inside with calm confidence. They were not loud. They did not need to be. Guests instinctively moved aside before they reached the center of the ballroom. Hotel staff straightened their posture. Even the musicians seemed quieter without missing a single note. In the middle of them walked a man who carried himself as though every room already belonged to him before he entered it. He was tall, dressed in an impeccably fitted charcoal suit, his dark hair neatly combed back, his blue-gray eyes scanning the crowd with measured patience instead of urgency. There was nothing theatrical about him. No raised voice. No dramatic entrance. Just absolute certainty. The little boy's face brightened instantly. He released my hand and ran forward with a laugh that echoed across the polished marble. The man's expression softened so subtly that I almost wondered if I had imagined it. He bent slightly, resting one hand on the child's shoulder before looking up. For one brief second, his eyes met mine across the ballroom. I should have looked away immediately. Instead, I froze, feeling as though he had noticed me in a room where people like me were never supposed to be seen. I told myself it had only been a glance. Important people looked at everyone when they entered a room. That was all it was. The little boy hugged the man's leg with complete trust, and the man rested his hand gently on the child's shoulder before quietly asking if everything was all right. I could not hear the reply from where I stood, but I watched the child point in my direction with the innocent enthusiasm only children possessed. For a heartbeat, those blue-gray eyes found mine again. There was no smile. No frown. Just quiet observation, as though he were memorizing details most people overlooked. Then he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and the child beamed before leading him farther into the ballroom. The strange moment disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Claire. My manager's sharp voice snapped me back to reality. Where have you been? Table 22 has been waiting for their drinks. Heat rushed into my face. I am sorry. Save it. Just move. I grabbed my tray and hurried toward the private dining section reserved for the evening's most influential guests. Every chair was occupied by people whose names regularly appeared in business magazines and newspaper headlines. Conversation stopped and started around million-dollar deals as casually as ordinary people discussed the weather. I kept my eyes lowered, placing glasses exactly where they belonged, reminding myself that blending into the background was always the safest choice. As I reached the final seat, one of the women looked up from her conversation and frowned. She was probably in her late 50s, dressed in a silver designer gown that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. A diamond bracelet circled her wrist, and her expression suggested she had never heard the word no in her entire life. Young lady, she said, examining me as though I were an object on display. You are blocking the light. I stepped back immediately. I apologize, ma'am. No, she continued, her voice carrying farther than necessary. I mean your entire presence is distracting. A few guests around the table chuckled politely. I forced my smile to remain in place even as my stomach tightened. It was not the first rude comment I had heard while working events like this. It probably would not be the last. I turned to leave, hoping the moment would fade, but another guest lifted his wineglass before speaking. He looked to be in his early 30s, wearing an expensive tuxedo and the confident grin of someone accustomed to entertaining every room he entered. Tell me, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, does the hotel hire anyone these days, or are standards simply disappearing? More laughter followed. I could feel people looking at me now. Not seeing me. Looking at me. There was a difference. My fingers tightened slightly around the silver tray, but I refused to let them shake. Nursing school had taught me that dignity often came from the smallest choices. You controlled your breathing. You controlled your voice. You controlled what the world could take from you. Would anyone care for fresh coffee? I asked calmly. My question only seemed to amuse them more. Listen to that, the man laughed. She actually thinks she belongs in the conversation. I swallowed carefully and kept my posture straight. Somewhere across the ballroom, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched again. I did not turn. I did not need to. Every instinct told me those steady blue-gray eyes had not left the room for long, and somehow that realization made the silence around me feel even heavier than the laughter. The laughter lingered for another few seconds before dissolving back into conversations about investments and vacation homes, as though embarrassing a waitress was nothing more than another form of entertainment. I lowered my eyes to the coffee pot in my hand, carefully filling each porcelain cup without spilling a single drop. My heartbeat echoed loudly in my ears, but my hand stayed steady. That mattered more than anyone in that room could understand. My grandmother had taught me years ago that dignity was not something another person could hand to you, and it was certainly not something they could take away with a careless sentence. It was a choice you made every single day. Thank you for your patience, I said quietly after setting the final cup on its saucer. Please let me know if you need anything else this evening. I turned with the same measured pace I had practiced through hundreds of exhausting shifts. I would not run away. I would not cry where strangers could congratulate themselves for causing it. Behind me another voice spoke, softer than the others but no less dismissive. Amazing, a woman said with an amused laugh. They trained them to sound grateful for everything. More quiet chuckles followed. I kept walking. Each step across the marble floor felt heavier than the last, but I refused to look back. I reached the service station near the ballroom entrance and placed the empty coffee pot onto the counter with more care than necessary. My manager approached almost immediately, his forehead lined with frustration. What happened over there? He whispered. Nothing that affects the service, I answered honestly. He glanced toward the VIP tables before lowering his voice even further. Those guests are important, Claire. Whatever they say, just smile and move on. We cannot afford complaints tonight. I nodded. There was no point arguing. He was worried about the hotel. I was worried about paying tuition next month. We were both protecting something that mattered to us. Before either of us could say another word, a hotel coordinator hurried into the service area holding a clipboard. Additional champagne for the Romano Foundation table, she called. They are expecting more guests. Several servers exchanged quick looks. Even I recognized the name now. Romano. It was the family the little boy had mentioned only minutes earlier. I lifted another silver tray, arranging crystal flutes in perfect rows before balancing the bottles beside them. As I stepped back into the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed almost imperceptibly. Conversations remained elegant, but people seemed more careful with their words. Eyes drifted discreetly toward the distinguished man who now stood speaking with several city officials near the grand staircase. Adrian Romano listened far more than he talked. Every person around him leaned in slightly when he spoke, not because his voice was loud, but because it never needed to be. Authority wrapped around him as naturally as his tailored suit. I tried not to stare. It was none of my business who he was or why everyone treated him with such respect. My only responsibility was delivering drinks without interrupting important conversations. Yet as I approached his table, the little boy noticed me first. His face lit up instantly. That is her, he announced with unmistakable excitement. She helped me when I was lost. Several heads turned toward me at once. Adrian slowly lifted his gaze from his conversation. His expression remained calm, unreadable, but this time there was something different in his eyes. It was not curiosity anymore. It was recognition, as though he had quietly reached a decision that no one else in the room had noticed. The little boy's smile was so genuine that I could not help smiling back despite everything that had happened only minutes earlier. "Thank you for helping Ethan," Adrian said, his voice calm and even. It was the first time I had heard him speak. There was no unnecessary warmth, but there was unmistakable sincerity. "He looked scared," I replied. Anyone would have done the same. One corner of his expression softened almost invisibly. "No," he answered. "Not everyone would." Before I could respond, another guest stepped beside the table carrying a glass of champagne. He was the same man who had laughed at me earlier, his polished smile returning as though our previous encounter had simply been harmless entertainment. "Adrian," he said confidently, extending a hand. "It has been too long." Adrian accepted the handshake with polite restraint. "Daniel." The two exchanged a few words about the charity event while I quietly began placing fresh champagne flutes around the table. My attention stayed on the tray. That was safer. Invisible. Familiar. I was almost finished when Daniel glanced toward me with a grin that immediately tightened my stomach. "Interesting choice for service tonight," he remarked casually. "Your hotel is certainly becoming inclusive." I kept arranging the glasses without reacting. Adrian said nothing. His eyes rested on Daniel, waiting. Encouraged by the silence, Daniel continued. "She was serving our table earlier. Sweet enough, I suppose. A little rough around the edges, but I guess every gala needs someone to remind us how fortunate we are." A couple of guests offered restrained smiles. Others suddenly became very interested in their drinks. The little boy looked between the adults, sensing something was wrong without understanding why. I finished placing the final glass and reached for the empty bottle. My instinct was simple. Leave. End the moment before it grew worse. "Actually," Daniel added before I could step away, "I believe someone compared her to trash earlier." Perhaps that was a bit harsh, but I understood the point. The sentence landed with a quiet heaviness that seemed louder than the orchestra playing only yards away. My fingers paused around the neck of the empty bottle. I felt dozens of eyes settling on me once again. Every lesson my grandmother had taught me echoed inside my mind. Stand straight. Breathe slowly. Never surrender your dignity just because someone else misplaced theirs. I lifted my head, meeting Daniel's gaze with calm eyes instead of anger. "Sir," I said politely, "is there anything else I can bring to your table this evening?" For the first time since he had begun speaking, Daniel looked almost disappointed. He had expected embarrassment. Perhaps tears. Perhaps an argument that would justify his behavior. Instead, I had offered professionalism. He laughed once under his breath. "No," he replied. "That will be all." I inclined my head respectfully and turned to leave, my pace steady despite the weight pressing against my chest. Before I had taken more than 2 steps, I heard another voice behind me. It was not loud. It did not need to be. "Miss Bennet." I stopped immediately. My heartbeat quickened as I slowly looked back. Adrian had not raised his voice. He had simply spoken my name with quiet certainty. The surprising part was not that he knew it. The surprising part was the unmistakable look of decision in his blue-gray eyes, as though everything that had happened over the last 15 minutes had led him to a conclusion that no one else in the ballroom could yet understand. My name sounded different when Adrian Romano said it. Not louder. Not sharper. Simply deliberate, as though every syllable had been chosen before he allowed himself to speak. I turned, balancing the empty bottle against my tray, suddenly aware that nearly everyone at the table had stopped pretending not to listen. "Yes, sir?" I asked. He regarded me for a long moment before asking, "How long have you worked here?" The question caught me off guard. 3 years. And nursing school? My eyes widened slightly. How did you know that? Ethan smiled proudly before Adrian could answer. You told me while we were looking for Uncle Adrian. I could not help laughing softly. I suppose I did. Adrian glanced down at the little boy with an expression that briefly replaced authority with something almost human. You remember everything, do not you? Ethan nodded enthusiastically. She wants to help sick people. Adrian looked back at me. That explains why you stopped for a frightened child when everyone else kept walking. I lowered my eyes for a moment, uncomfortable with being praised for something that had felt so ordinary. It was only a few minutes. Sometimes a few minutes change someone's day, he replied. Before I could answer, Daniel let out an amused laugh from across the table. Adrian, surely you are not interviewing the staff. A few polite smiles appeared around him. She did her job. Let us not turn basic courtesy into sainthood. Adrian remained perfectly still. Kindness is never basic. The sentence was calm, almost conversational, but something in the atmosphere shifted. Daniel shrugged, lifting his champagne glass. Perhaps. Although I still think your standards are higher than mine. I do not become emotionally invested in waitresses. His words drew another uncomfortable silence. I wished desperately that I could disappear into the crowd. This conversation had become far bigger than anything I wanted to be part of. Excuse me, I said quietly. Other guests are waiting. I took one step backward. Then Daniel spoke again. Honestly, Adrian, people like her should be grateful simply to be in rooms like this. Everyone has a place. Some people build the table. Others serve it. I felt the words settle over the ballroom like dust. Not because they were new. I had heard versions of them my entire working life. Rich enough to be served. Poor enough to remain unseen. The difference tonight was that someone else had heard them too. Adrian slowly rose from his chair. No dramatic movement. No anger crossed his face. He simply stood, adjusted the front of his charcoal jacket, and looked directly at Daniel. The musicians continued playing, but the nearest conversations quietly faded away. Even those who had not been listening a moment earlier now sensed something had changed. Adrian spoke with the same measured tone he had used since entering the ballroom. You believe a person's value is measured by where they stand in the room. Daniel smiled confidently. Usually. Adrian gave a small nod, as though acknowledging the honesty of the answer. Then his blue-gray eyes shifted toward me. They did not carry pity. They carried certainty. I measure people differently, he said. He took 2 unhurried steps in my direction until he stood beside me instead of across the table. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the orchestra. Every face in the ballroom seemed frozen in place. Adrian met Daniel's eyes one final time before speaking words so calm, so unexpected, that the silence itself seemed to stop breathing. Then allow me to introduce you properly, he said. You are looking at my future wife. For one impossible second, I wondered if I had imagined the words. The ballroom seemed to lose every sound except the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. The orchestra continued playing somewhere behind us, but the music felt distant, muffled beneath the weight of hundreds of stunned expressions turning in our direction. I stared at Adrian, searching his face for the smallest hint that this was some elaborate joke, but there was nothing playful in his expression. He stood beside me with the same quiet confidence he had carried since walking into the hotel, as though he had merely stated an obvious fact instead of changing the course of my entire evening. Daniel blinked twice before letting out a short, uncertain laugh. That is an interesting sense of humor, he said. Adrian did not smile. I was not joking. The words landed gently, but they carried the kind of certainty that left no room for argument. Around the table, conversations had completely stopped. Several guests exchanged confused glances while others discreetly reached for their phones before apparently deciding against it. Even my manager stood frozen near the service station, staring at us with an expression that suggested he had forgotten every instruction he had ever given his staff. I finally remembered how to breathe. Sir, I said quietly, careful to keep my voice respectful, there must be some misunderstanding. Adrian turned toward me, and for the first time that evening, the intensity in his eyes softened. There is no misunderstanding, Miss Bennet. We have never even met before tonight. Not officially, he replied. His answer only deepened my confusion. Ethan looked delighted by the entire exchange, tugging lightly on Adrian's sleeve. Does this mean Claire is coming to Sunday dinner? A few nervous smiles appeared around the table, but Adrian simply rested his hand on the boy's shoulder. Perhaps someday, he answered. Daniel shook his head in disbelief. Adrian, you cannot expect anyone to believe this. I do not require anyone's belief, Adrian answered calmly. Only their respect. His gaze drifted across the guests surrounding the table, never rising above a conversational tone. Especially toward people who have earned it. Nobody responded. It amazed me how quickly the room that had laughed at me only moments earlier had become completely silent. The same people who had been eager to judge now seemed determined not to say another careless word. I felt every eye following me, yet the feeling was entirely different now. Before, they had looked through me. Now they were trying to understand me. Neither feeling was comfortable. I tightened my grip on the silver tray, wishing I could somehow return to being invisible. Adrian seemed to notice my uneasiness. You should finish your shift, he said. You have responsibilities. I nodded automatically. Yes, sir. As I turned to leave, he spoke once more, his voice carrying only far enough for me to hear. Claire. I looked back. Do not allow anyone else's opinion to decide your worth. They have not earned that privilege. I could not find the right words. After everything that had happened, all I managed was a quiet, sincere, thank you. Adrian gave the slightest nod before returning his attention to the people around him, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Yet I knew, even before I walked away, that nothing about my life would ever feel ordinary again. Somewhere behind me, whispers began spreading from table to table like ripples across still water, and every instinct told me the evening's real story had only just begun. I finished the remainder of my shift on instinct alone. My hands continued pouring coffee, collecting empty plates, and replacing crystal glasses with the same precision they always had, but my mind remained trapped in the moment Adrian Romano had spoken those impossible words. Every time I crossed the ballroom, conversation softened as I passed. Some guests offered polite smiles that had not existed earlier. Others studied me with open curiosity, trying to solve a mystery that I could not explain because I did not understand it myself. Even the employees looked at me differently. My manager approached only once during the next hour. He cleared his throat awkwardly before speaking. Claire, if you need anything, let me know. I almost laughed at how strange that sounded coming from the same man who had reminded me only minutes earlier to keep important guests happy at any cost. I am all right, I answered. He nodded quickly before hurrying away, leaving me with even more questions than before. Shortly after 11 o'clock, the charity auction concluded, and guests slowly began making their way toward the exits. Expensive evening gowns disappeared beneath tailored coats. Chauffeurs lined the entrance outside while hotel staff thanked everyone for attending. I slipped into the employee locker room, finally removing the uncomfortable dress shoes that had punished my feet all evening. My reflection in the small mirror looked exhausted. A few loose strands of blonde hair had escaped my ponytail, and shadows rested beneath my green eyes after another 12-hour shift. I looked exactly like the same woman who had walked into work that afternoon. Yet somehow I felt like a stranger to myself. After changing into my old jeans, white sweater, and worn sneakers, I slung my backpack over one shoulder and stepped outside into the cool Manhattan night. The city air carried the familiar mix of traffic, rain on concrete, and food carts closing for the evening. I breathed deeply, hoping normal life would return the moment I left the hotel behind. My apartment was only 3 subway stops away. Tomorrow I had an early nursing lecture followed by another evening shift. Real life still existed. At least I wanted to believe it did. I had barely reached the sidewalk when a calm voice called my name once again. Miss Bennett. I turned to find one of the men who had accompanied Adrian earlier walking toward me. He wore the same perfectly tailored dark suit, though his expression was unexpectedly courteous. Good evening, he said. Mr. Romano asked me to deliver a message. My pulse quickened despite myself. What kind of message? He extended a simple cream-colored envelope. There was no logo. No decoration. Only my name written neatly across the front in dark blue ink. He asked that you read it before making any assumptions about tonight. I hesitated for several seconds before accepting it. The paper felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. Is he still inside? I asked. The man glanced toward the hotel entrance before shaking his head. Mr. Romano has already left. I looked down at the envelope again. Why me? The man offered the faintest smile. That is a question only he can answer. With a respectful nod, he returned to a waiting black sedan parked quietly along the curb. The vehicle pulled away without hurry, disappearing into the stream of city traffic. I stood alone beneath the glowing hotel lights, the sealed envelope resting in my trembling hands. Whatever waited inside had begun long before tonight, and for the first time, I realized Adrian Romano had not spoken like a man making a sudden decision. He had spoken like someone finally revealing one that had already been made. I did not open the envelope right away. Instead, I slipped it carefully into my backpack and started walking toward the subway station, hoping the familiar rhythm of the city would quiet the questions racing through my mind. Yellow taxis rolled past in steady lines, their headlights reflecting off damp pavement left behind by an afternoon shower. Street musicians packed away their instruments while office workers hurried toward late trains, their conversations blending into the constant heartbeat of Manhattan. Nobody looked at me twice. Nobody knew what had happened inside the Grand Lexington Hotel. Somehow that felt comforting. By the time I reached the station platform, curiosity had become impossible to ignore. I found an empty bench beneath a flickering light and finally removed the cream-colored envelope from my bag. My name was still written across the front in elegant handwriting that looked deliberate rather than rushed. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of thick white paper. There were only a few lines. Miss Bennet, tonight you were placed in a situation you never asked for. I regret that my decision involved you without explanation. If you are willing to hear the truth before reaching your own conclusion, please join me tomorrow at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. No obligation. No pressure. The address is enclosed. Adrian Romano. I turned the page over, expecting to find more, but that was all. Tucked behind the letter was a small card bearing nothing except an address on the Upper East Side. No company logo. No title. Just a location. I read the letter 3 more times, searching for hidden meaning between the words. There was none. It was surprisingly simple. Surprisingly respectful. He had not demanded my presence. He had not assumed I would come. He had simply asked for the chance to explain. The train arrived with a rush of warm air, pulling me back to reality. During the ride home, I watched the dark tunnel race past the windows while the folded letter rested in my lap. Every logical part of my mind insisted I should throw it away. Men with power did not suddenly involve complete strangers in their lives without a reason. Whatever reason Adrian had, it almost certainly had nothing to do with romance. Yet another part of me remembered the way he had spoken to Ethan. The way he had thanked me for helping a frightened child. The way he had never once spoken down to me, even when everyone else in that ballroom had. Those details refused to disappear. My apartment greeted me with familiar silence. It was a tiny studio on the 4th floor of an aging brick building where the radiator rattled whenever the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. A stack of nursing textbooks waited on the kitchen table beside unpaid bills and tomorrow's class schedule. Usually those things occupied every corner of my attention. Tonight they barely registered. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, changed into comfortable clothes, and sat beside the window overlooking the quiet street below. Around midnight my phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Emma. How was the fancy charity event? Did rich people behave themselves for once? I stared at the screen before typing a reply. You would not believe me if I told you. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Try me. I smiled despite myself but locked the phone without answering. Some stories sounded unbelievable even to the people living them. As I looked once more at the folded letter resting beside my tea, I realized tomorrow would determine whether tonight had been a strange misunderstanding or the beginning of something neither Adrian nor I could ever take back. Sleep never really came that night. I closed my eyes for a few hours, but every time I drifted off, I found myself standing beneath the crystal chandeliers again, hearing Adrian calmly speak words that had overturned everything I believed about my ordinary life. By 7 o'clock the next morning, I had already showered, packed my nursing textbooks, and convinced myself I was going to ignore the invitation completely. Real life demanded practical decisions, not mysterious meetings with influential strangers. My morning pharmacology lecture passed in a blur. Professor Wilson discussed medication safety while I copied notes automatically, although I could not remember writing a single sentence afterward. Emma nudged my shoulder halfway through class. "You have been staring at the same page for 10 minutes, she whispered. "Seriously, what happened last night?" I managed a tired smile. "I promise I will tell you eventually." She studied my face for another moment before nodding. "Whatever it is, you look like someone just turned your whole world upside down." She had no idea how accurate that was. After class ended shortly before noon, I stepped outside into bright autumn sunshine. The letter remained folded inside my backpack. I stopped beside a coffee cart, ordered a small black coffee, and checked the time. 12:15. If I took the subway immediately, I could reach the address before 1 o'clock. I looked down the opposite sidewalk toward the station that would take me home. Then I looked at the cream-colored card one more time. Curiosity was a dangerous thing, my grandmother used to warn me. But she had also taught me something else. Never judge a person's intentions without giving them the opportunity to reveal them. Before I realized I had made the decision, my feet were already carrying me toward the downtown train instead of the uptown platform. 40 minutes later I stepped onto one of the quietest streets I had ever seen in Manhattan. Elegant townhouses lined both sides of the block, their brick facades decorated with neatly trimmed hedges and iron gates. The address led me to a historic limestone mansion that looked more like a private museum than someone's residence. There were no flashing signs, no dramatic security checkpoint, no crowd waiting outside. Just a black sedan parked neatly along the curb and a uniformed doorman who greeted me with a respectful nod. "Miss Bennett?" he asked. I hesitated. "Yes. Mr. Romano has been expecting you." Somehow that sentence made me even more nervous. He opened the front door, revealing a grand entrance filled with natural light pouring through tall windows. Polished oak floors stretched beneath an elegant staircase, while shelves lined with books covered one entire wall. Fresh flowers rested on a marble table near the entrance, filling the room with the faint scent of lilies instead of expensive cologne or cigar smoke. It did not feel cold. It felt lived in. Before I had time to absorb my surroundings, familiar footsteps approached from the adjoining hallway. Adrian appeared without an audience, without a tailored entourage, dressed simply in a navy sweater and dark slacks instead of the formal suit from the gala. For the first time since meeting him, he looked less like an untouchable public figure and more like an ordinary man carrying responsibilities few people could imagine. He stopped several feet away, offering a small, respectful nod. "Thank you for coming, Claire," he said. "I know I have asked for something your trust has not yet earned." "That is exactly what I hope to change today." Adrian led me into a sunlit library where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves replaced the intimidating luxury I had expected to find. Large windows overlooked a quiet courtyard filled with maple trees beginning to turn shades of gold and crimson. A tea service rested on a low wooden table beside 2 comfortable chairs, creating an atmosphere that felt surprisingly ordinary. He waited until I had taken a seat before sitting across from me, leaving enough space that I never felt cornered. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally he broke the silence. "You deserve an explanation, and I will not insult you by asking for trust before I earn it." I folded my hands together to keep them from fidgeting. Then tell me why you said those things in front of everyone. Adrian nodded once. Because I knew exactly what would happen if I stayed silent. He looked toward the window before continuing. People like Daniel do not always stop with cruel words. Public humiliation has a way of becoming permission for others to continue it. I have spent enough years watching powerful people mistake silence for agreement. His calm voice never rose, but every sentence carried quiet conviction. When I saw the way you handled yourself, I realized something. I tilted my head slightly. What? You never tried to embarrass anyone in return. You protected your dignity without taking someone else's. I looked down at my hands. I was trying not to lose my job. A faint smile appeared on his face. Perhaps. But many people would have responded differently. I let out a slow breath. That still does not explain why you introduced me the way you did. Adrian reached into a leather folder resting on the table and carefully removed an old newspaper clipping protected inside a clear sleeve. He slid it toward me without saying a word. I looked down at the faded photograph. It showed a community food drive outside a neighborhood church almost 4 years earlier. Volunteers stood behind folding tables stacked with canned goods and winter coats. Near the center of the picture, a younger version of myself was kneeling beside an elderly woman, helping tie the laces on a pair of donated boots. I stared at the image in disbelief. I remember this, I whispered. Our nursing program volunteered there. Adrian nodded. My foundation quietly funded that event. I looked up. You were there? Briefly. I never saw you. You were not supposed to. His answer surprised me again. I often visit projects without announcing who I am. People behave differently when they believe nobody important is watching. He paused before adding, I noticed something that afternoon. My eyes returned to the photograph. What did I do? An elderly man offered you $100 because he thought you worked for the church. I remembered instantly. The man had insisted on paying me for my kindness even after I explained I was only volunteering. I thanked him, I said quietly, and asked him to donate the money to someone who needed groceries more than I did. Adrian nodded. You walked away before realizing I had heard the entire conversation. I looked back at him, struggling to connect that ordinary afternoon with everything that had happened since. You remembered me for 4 years? Not because you impressed me, he answered gently. Because you reminded me that kindness still existed without cameras, applause, or expectation. Last night, when Ethan described the woman who helped him without asking who his family was, I recognized you before I ever learned your name. I sat in complete silence, the faded photograph resting between us, slowly realizing that what had seemed like an impossible coincidence had actually begun years before either of us understood where that single quiet act of kindness would eventually lead. I looked at the photograph for what felt like several minutes before carefully sliding it back across the table. It was remarkable how one forgotten afternoon could still exist so clearly in someone else's memory. I almost did not come today, I admitted. Adrian folded the newspaper clipping and placed it back inside the folder with the same care someone might use for an irreplaceable family photograph. I expected that possibility, he replied. That is why I wrote the letter instead of sending someone to persuade you. I studied him for a moment. Then why say I was your future wife? Why not simply tell everyone they should treat people with respect? A quiet smile touched his face, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Because people like Daniel rarely change their behavior after a lecture. They change it when the person they dismissed suddenly becomes someone they are afraid to disrespect. I frowned slightly. So I became part of your strategy. For one evening, he answered honestly. Yes. His directness caught me off guard. He was not trying to excuse himself. He was simply telling the truth. That was unfair to you, and I owe you an apology. He stood, walked toward the bookshelf, and returned holding a small wooden box no larger than a paperback novel. Setting it gently on the table, he opened the lid. Inside rested a simple silver pendant shaped like a small compass. It was elegant without being extravagant. "This belonged to my mother," Adrian said quietly. "Before she passed away, she told me something I have never forgotten. She said that power only matters if it points you toward the right people instead of pulling you away from them." He picked up the pendant, letting it rest in his palm. "For years I believed success meant building walls high enough that nobody could reach me. Then I started quietly visiting schools, hospitals, shelters, and community programs funded by our foundation. I wanted to know whether our work actually mattered. That is where I first saw you." He looked at the pendant before closing his fingers around it. "You reminded me that character reveals itself when no one expects recognition." I felt my throat tighten. "You built an opinion of me without ever speaking to me." "I built respect," he corrected gently. "Affection came much later, and only because every report I received about those programs seemed to include another story involving the same nursing student who kept helping people after everyone else had gone home." I blinked in surprise. "Reports?" He gave an almost embarrassed smile. "My foundation sponsors several scholarships. Volunteers occasionally become scholarship recipients. Your name appeared more than once, although you declined assistance because you believed another student needed it more." I laughed softly in disbelief. "I never imagined anyone noticed." "That," Adrian said, "is exactly why I noticed." Silence settled comfortably between us. It no longer felt awkward. It felt thoughtful. After a while I finally asked the question that had remained in my mind since the ballroom. "What happens now?" Adrian looked directly into my eyes. "Now you return to your life exactly as you planned. You finish nursing school. You continue becoming the woman you already are." He paused before continuing. "As for me, I would like the opportunity to know you honestly, without grand announcements, assumptions, or expectations. If, someday, you decide there is room for me in your life, I will consider that a privilege rather than an achievement." For the first time since walking into his home, I realized he was offering me something far more valuable than influence or wealth. He was offering me the freedom to choose, and somehow that quiet respect carried more weight than every impressive title attached to Adrian Romano's name. I did return to my life, just as Adrian had asked me to. I finished my shifts at the Grand Lexington Hotel, attended every nursing lecture, and spent late nights studying beside the same apartment window where I had once stared at his letter, wondering whether opening it would change everything. It turned out the letter had not changed my life. The choices that followed did. Adrian never appeared unexpectedly. He never used his influence to interrupt my routines or impress me with grand gestures. Instead, he invited me to ordinary things. Coffee after class. A walk through Central Park on crisp Saturday mornings. Volunteer events sponsored quietly through his foundation where nobody introduced him as anything other than Adrian. It was there, far away from crystal chandeliers and expensive suits, that I met the man hidden beneath the reputation. He remembered the names of elderly volunteers. He carried folding chairs before anyone asked. He listened more than he spoke. The children adored him because he never treated them as interruptions. Months passed before I finally understood something that had escaped me the night we met. His greatest strength had never been the respect people gave him. It was the respect he chose to give others first. My graduation arrived the following spring beneath bright blue skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming cherry trees across the university lawn. As I accepted my nursing diploma, I spotted Emma cheering louder than anyone else, Ethan waving both hands excitedly, and Adrian standing quietly beside them with the same calm smile I had come to know so well. There were no photographers waiting for him. No speeches. He applauded like every other proud guest. Later that afternoon, while we walked through a peaceful botanical garden, Adrian stopped beside a small stone bridge overlooking a pond where sunlight danced across the water. "Do you remember something you asked me?" he said. I smiled. "I asked you many difficult questions." He laughed softly. "You asked what happened next." He reached into his jacket pocket and removed the small silver compass pendant that had belonged to his mother. Instead of placing it around his own neck, he gently held it toward me. She believed real love should always help two people find the right direction without asking either of them to lose themselves. His voice remained steady, but I could see hope quietly shining in his blue-gray eyes. Claire Bennett, I have never wanted someone to belong to me. I have only hoped we might choose to belong beside each other. Will you marry me? Tears filled my eyes before I even realized I was crying. Not because he was powerful. Not because he was wealthy. But because from the very beginning he had given me the one thing I had fought to protect my entire life. My dignity. Yes, I whispered. Yes, I will. Our wedding took place 6 months later in a small historic chapel surrounded by family, close friends, and the volunteers who had unknowingly brought our lives together years before. There were no extravagant displays. Just laughter, music, simple white flowers, and promises spoken from honest hearts. During his vows, Adrian looked into my eyes with the same quiet certainty I had first seen in the ballroom. The world may judge people by status, titles, or appearances, he said. I chose long ago to judge you by your heart, and every day since then has proven that choice right. Looking back now, I understand my grandmother's words better than ever. Character is revealed not by how we treat those who can change our future, but by how we treat those who seemingly cannot. Because sometimes the person the world overlooks is the very person who reminds someone powerful what truly matters, and sometimes the greatest love story begins the moment one person decides that another's dignity is worth protecting.